On behalf of the UNC Center for Media Law and Policy, I'm very happy to welcome Miriam Nisbet and her extended family to the Southeast Colloquium. Several members of her family are here, and I think that bodes well for her presentation. I know her brother's here. She wouldn't dare not do a great job in front of her brother, who would tease her first. Your big brother, yeah. The pressure is definitely on. The professors and the students are any threat to you, but the family, a lot of pressure there. Last fall, the National Archives and Records Administration hired Miriam Nisbet to be the first director of its Office of Government Information Services in Washington, D.C. The Office of Government Information Services was created by the 2007 FOIA amendments to help resolve access disputes between government agencies and access requesters. Ms. Nisbet's duties in her new job also include reviewing the federal government's FOIA policies, reviewing government agency compliance with FOIA, and recommending policy changes to Congress and to the President to improve the administration of the Freedom of Information Act. Ms. Nisbet has had a long and important career as an open government advocate. She worked for UNESCO in Paris as director of the Information Society Division. In that capacity, she promoted support for libraries and archives and promoted the use of information and communication technologies for education, science, culture, and development. She also worked as legislative counsel for the American Library Association. There she focused primarily on intellectual property issues raised by the digital information environment, and she provided advice on law and policy concerning access to government information and privacy. Other previous posts on her resume included Special Counsel for Information Policy in the National Archives and Records Administration and Deputy Director of the Office of Information and Privacy in the U.S. Department of Justice. Obviously, Ms. Nisbet needed to be extremely well educated in order to be so successful, and she is extremely well educated. She earned a bachelor's degree in history and a law degree, both from UNC at Chapel Hill. The title, of Ms. Nisbet's address is Teaching Watchdogs New Transparency Tricks. Ms. Nisbet, welcome home to Carolina.
Thank you very much. Now, the first question I have to ask, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. And my lovely assistant, Nora Sullivan, is ensuring that we stop our slideshow. I don't know if all of you have been able to see, but we had a little bit of a loop going there about the Freedom of Information Act in the news. And if you had a chance to look at it, you can see that there are so many stories that have been generated through good journalism and good requesting under the Freedom of Information Act. I do have to say, I was telling Lolly Gassaway, with whom I've had the pleasure of working for many years, that the slideshow was prepared by one of our new hires in the Office of Government Information Services, Corey Zarek, who had her degree in journalism before she went to law school, and that would explain why it's so topical and a hope of interest to you. So, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I particularly think that this is an auspicious occasion, being the Friday before Sunshine Week, which starts next week. Traditionally begins on March the 15th with a celebration of the birthday of James Madison, who is often called the founder of the Freedom of Information movement, and certainly someone to whom we all look for inspiration. Actually, one of my favorite quotations is from Thomas Jefferson, who said, information is the currency of democracy. True then, true now. Numerous of our leaders and members of civil society, not to mention members of the press, have certainly reiterated this principle over the years and really tried to make it a reality. But getting the principles of openness and transparency into the words of a statute was not really an easy road. Thus, it was a very pleasant surprise when, on his first full day in office, President Obama issued a directive on the Freedom of Information Act. He declared, "In our democracy, the Freedom of Information Act, which encourages accountability through transparency, is the most prominent expression of a profound national commitment to ensuring an open government." Those were sweet words to those of us who have worked in this area for such a long time. The first FOIA was enacted in 1966 over President Johnson's strong objections. Bill Moyers, who was an aide in the White House at the time, reported that, quote, "LBJ had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the signing. He hated the very idea of the Freedom of Information Act. He hated the thought of journalists rummaging in government closets and opening government files. He hated them challenging the official view of reality. He dug in his heels and even threatened to pocket veto the bill after it reached the White House." Not something that I think President Johnson would have wanted to be known for, but that's the truth. Congress then did its usual oversight of FOIA. How is it working? And it was particularly important in the years 1972 to 74, when there was certainly a great deal of interest in what the government was up to with the Watergate scandal, looking at the operations and activities of the government, particularly in the White House and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And Congress found that even then, just a few short years after the FOIA had been enacted, there were excessive delays in responding to requests. There were excessive fees for searching and copying documents. There were burdensome and costly legal remedies after exhaustion of administrative remedies, and a very real concern that the news media was opting not to use the FOIA because of these kinds of problems. Very troubling in view of the traditional role of the media as watchdog and being the public's ears and eyes. But with Watergate as the background, the 1974 amendments to the FOIA are what really put teeth into the act. It's what we really think of as the modern statute that has been the model for a lot of state open records laws, and really was really when FOIA started to be used. Now, I'm gonna go back to basics here for a minute, because there are quite a few of you here who are very familiar with FOIA, but maybe not everybody. Actually, let me just ask, have any of you here ever made a request under FOIA, either the federal law or your state open records law? Okay, good, quite a few of you. The federal FOIA is pretty simple, at least in theory. First of all, it only applies to executive branch agencies. It doesn't apply to the judiciary. It doesn't apply to Congress, only the executive branch. We're still waiting for Congress to pass one that applies to Congress, but we may be waiting for a while on that. But it works pretty simply. If a person makes a request to an agency, reasonably describing the records sought, and in accordance with the agency rules, which usually means you agree to pay some fees, unless you fall into a certain category. News reporting is one of them. You don't have to pay fees if you get that. The records are supposed to be made promptly available. Now, there are 9 exceptions that allows the government to withhold information. Most of you are probably familiar, at least generally, with what those exceptions are. National security, so the records are classified. There are law enforcement exceptions that particularly give cognizance to records that are subject to a current law enforcement proceeding, or records that might invade the personal privacy of someone. There are exceptions that deal with commercial information, that is, information that's been given to the government by commercial entities. There is an exception, number 8, that up until recently has been hardly ever used, and certainly very little litigated or probed into, and that has to do with information that is given to the government by financial institutions. And as you can imagine, that is now being tested a great deal. There are quite in fact, some lawsuits going on right now by Bloomberg News, New York Times, Washington Post, to really test the limits of what the government can withhold with regard to financial institutions. So that's the way it works. You ask for the records, you get the records. Also, the federal agencies are held to statutory time limits, which are to respond to a request 20 working days, which maybe you might think is a long time, but probably not really long enough for most agencies, particularly the large ones, to really be able to even take the request in, send a response to you to tell you that they have the request, and really to start looking for the records. So the time limits remain still very much an issue. If you're dissatisfied with the response that you get, you have the right to file an administrative appeal within the agency. And then if you're not happy with that, up until now, up until the Open Government Act of 2007, your only recourse was go to court, file a suit against the federal government, and hope for the best. So those are the basics, and Congress has continued to make improvements through the years, sometimes tinkering a little bit, sometimes making big changes, for example, to deal with the impact of technology, but trying to make things work more efficiently and more effectively. It's still proved to be more difficult and more costly than I think most anybody could have imagined. Justice Antonin Scalia, who was not a fan of the Freedom of Information Act, said in 1982, FOIA is the Taj Mahal of the doctrine of unanticipated consequences. The Sistine Chapel of cost-benefit analysis ignored. That always makes me laugh because it sounds just like him. And it's tempting to, just sort of toss them about when you consider what a big complex system the FOIA has become in the 27 years since he said them. There are 92 federal departments and agencies. There are more than 600,000 FOIA requests received by the agencies each year, and there are a little less than 9,000 administrative appeals from denials, partial or full, from those requests. The estimated cost in fiscal year 2008, which are the most recent figures, the 2009 figures are just now being tallied. The 2008 fiscal year cost for administering FOIA was about $1/3 of $1 billion. So it's a big system. Certainly unanticipated consequences would include the use of FOIA by commercial entities, competitors who are looking for records relating to contracts perhaps that their competitors have gotten, and certainly a massive and growing backlog of classified records. There are currently about 410 million, it's such a huge figure, 410 million records at the National Archives that are awaiting declassification. and about 3 million pages of scanned presidential records that are ready to be processed but have not been released to the public yet. So it's a big and difficult system. But our government is premised on the belief that the people have a right to learn what their government is doing through access to government information, and in today's parlance we might say that's priceless. In fact, President Obama made precisely that point when he was in China recently, when he publicly declared that access to information is a universal right. First time an official of the US has made such a statement. So rather than scale back on FOIA, Congress has, time and again, with significant input from the public and from the agencies, attempted to fine-tune the provisions to address things like fees and the time limits, the exemptions from disclosure, and as I said, the impact of technology. Most recently, those amendments included establishing the Office of Government Information Services, which is considered a key reform of the law. Well, what is this new office going to do? What are we doing? I want to tell you a little bit about that. Our mission is really two-pronged. One has to do with reviewing agency compliance, and the other has to do with providing mediation services to all government agencies. But sort of the overlay to this, and this is really the reform part in concept. Congress has been from the beginning, before the law was passed and since, referring to OGIS, the Office of Government Information Services, as the FOIA Ombudsman. Really looking to this office to be a place that anyone can come to, whether a requester, whether a government agency, for help, for guidance, as resource, as a place to figure out how to solve problems having to do with the administration of FOIA. This is a position that has existed for a few years now in many countries that have passed FOIA, often based upon the US law. But it has never existed in the US, and Congress really felt that there was a need for that, someplace, a neutral body that could be that play that ombuds role. The mission, as I said, is twofold. One is providing mediation services to resolve disputes between FOIA requesters and government agencies as an alternative to litigation. It's funny, a number of people since we opened our doors about 6 months ago, started hiring staff and figuring out how to do this job, have said, when I've explained to them what our mission is, people have said, what a good idea. Why hasn't that been done before? The idea that there would be another mechanism besides going to court to solve sometimes some very simple problems, sometimes just a misunderstanding in communication about what a requester is looking for and what the government can provide. It really is a simple idea, obviously, whose time has come. So all we have to do is figure out how to do that for 92 departments and agencies with a staff of 6. But we're working on that. We actually have quite a few approaches, and it seems to be working pretty well so far. We are doing informal mediation with our staff. We are establishing a formal mediation program, and we are looking at ways of using existing resources within the government already. That is the alternative dispute resolution programs that exist at every agency to really, for the first time, marry the alternative dispute resolution people to the FOIA people. They've never had a conversation. We have not found one agency so far in which they've ever even talked to each other. So we're getting that going, and I can report that we have 3 agencies so far that have volunteered to be pilots in doing that. One is the Department of Defense, which covers a lot of ground, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the Department of the Interior, which for those of you who have been following FOIA know that Interior has had quite a few lawsuits, and most recently a gazillion-dollar settlement, including in part because of their lack of response in FOIA cases. So that's one thing that we're doing. Now, if that's not enough, we have another mission as well, and that is that we're charged with reviewing agency compliance. We're looking at how agencies are implementing the law, looking at their policies, looking at their procedures, and making recommendations to the President and to Congress on ways to improve that performance. That's an interesting task as well. In that regard, we are working very closely with the Department of Justice, which also has jurisdiction in this area. We are working with the Chief Technology Officer and the President's Open Government Initiative. If you all haven't been hearing about the Open Government Initiative, I hope you will soon. I'll just tell you real briefly that the President, along with directing agencies to improve their performance in FOIA, has also directed agencies to improve openness, transparency, accountability, and really has all the agencies working right now on open government plans and ways to really just make openness and transparency a true way of operating, a real advance, I think, and a good thing for FOIA for sure. In fact, President Obama issued another memo at the same time that he issued his FOIA memorandum in January 2009 with a memo centered around openness, transparency, and accountability. He directed government agencies to, quote, use innovative tools, methods, and systems to cooperate among themselves across all levels of government and with nonprofit organizations, businesses, and individuals in the private sector. So a real push for collaboration, for participation, and a whole, outlook on really changing the culture of government. He also directed us to harness new technologies to put information about agency operations and decisions online and readily available to the public. We're going to need to do that. We're going to need a lot of innovation and a lot of creativity to deal with what's been called information inflation. There are approximately 30 billion emails that are created or received by federal agencies each year. And at the same time, we are creating a rather awesome number of documents digitally, including photographs, maps, multimedia documents, databases, audio and visual recordings, not to mention Web 2.0 applications. How are we going to handle these things? It's a huge amount of information. Some of these have to be preserved forever, and that's where we look to my colleagues at the National Archives for doing that. Those are the ones that have historical value, but others have to be preserved for varying lengths of time for government operations, for public availability, whether proactively or through FOIA, and our ability to manage those records is really severely challenged. It leads some people to ask whether freedom of information in the digital age is a contradiction in terms. And that's because one unthinkable scenario is that the FOIA is going to become less and less useful as the government struggles to rise to the challenge of managing, storing, and searching for, not to mention making accessible, this vast collection of electronic records, including formats that we don't even know today. Another way of looking at it is that agencies will become so adept at making information available online for access anytime, anywhere, any place, that using the FOIA will become unnecessary. I don't really think we should look for that anytime, and I really hope not. I don't really think that's desirable. I think we always need, particularly those of you here in this room, to be looking for ways that you can use the open records laws, federal or state, to find out what the government is up to. But there is a real problem and a real concern that using FOIA, particularly for those of you who are in the business of finding and creating news, because it's perceived as simply too slow a way to get information. I'm going to suggest, if you are thinking that and you're thinking it doesn't work for you and why bother, that really maybe what we need to look for is just a different approach, a different way of using it. It may not be the way to get the next day story, but it's a valuable way to see what information might contribute over time to a next day story and what might work in a bigger package someday. As an example of that, I would look to another UNC grad, Sarah Cohen, who writes for what is now my hometown Washington, D.C. newspaper, The Washington Post, and who's currently over at the Sanford Center for Public Policy at Duke. Don't boo. If you don't know of Sarah, I'd really encourage you to look into the way she has worked. She won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative reporting. She has been just one of those really creative, out-front journalists who has used databases, really probed into the work of government by using the big databases that are available that other people probably have just looked over and said, we can't be bothered, but the kinds of things that can be mined for real strong investigative reporting. Sometimes that takes months or years to come up with, and that's not something typically that you think of when you're thinking about trying to get access to information through FOIA. But that long-term reporting, that longer view, is really something that I think is probably the way to go. Speaking of that, if you've not had a chance to look recently at some of the information, particularly the big databases, the big data sets that are being made available by the government, I'd really encourage you to do it. Go to a site called data.gov, and there's an enormous amount of information there. That is, again, part of the Open Government Initiative. All agencies are being pushed to get significant databases and data sets and information holdings out there and available online. That's data.gov. And it's real interesting, so hope you'll go to it. We also believe that certainly that introducing mediation into this process is also something that's going to make a difference, that really can make for a culture change, particularly in how agencies work with requesters and become more and more responsive to them. We're looking at, and in fact, in 2 weeks, our office is launching our first training course for FOIA professionals in dispute resolution skills. We're hoping that that's going to be a recurring course. We're already looking for dates well into the future. and it's really going to be teaching FOIA professionals not to be mediators, but how to talk to requesters and how to deal with people in their agencies to get better results when they do searches for records, which ultimately I hope will help you as well. For sure, a democratic society depends upon openness and accountability and participation, very important, participation by an informed citizenry. To achieve that, we need journalists to be rummaging in government closets and opening government files. President Johnson may have feared that, but it's just what good government needs. And I will close with Justice Brandeis's famous words, "Sunlight is the best disinfectant." Thank you. Thank you. Do we have time for any questions, or are we at the end of our time?
We have a little time for some questions.
Okay, 5 minutes?
About 5-10 minutes, sure.
Okay, great.
You mentioned Sarah Cohen. Sarah was in our school at UNC last week, and she mentioned that how some of the federal agencies consider her and her colleagues a troublemaker. Can you give us a troublemaker story?
Let me be sure. Who did she say was considering her a troublemaker?
Not you, but
But some people in government. I expect that's what you mean. She meant. Yeah, definitely not me. As you can tell, I really admire her. I'm a big fan. I read her stories when they were breaking in the Post, and actually sat down and had a great conversation with Sarah a couple of months ago. She is in Washington from time to time. She hasn't moved. She's only on sabbatical and will come back to the Post, we hope. But I think that what she's referring to, and again, this is where we are really looking for a culture change in government. It's going to take a long time, but there really has been a tradition of almost an adversarial approach between FOIA requesters and government agency personnel. I would say not necessarily so much on the part of the requesters, but honestly from the government agencies. I think that's in large part a result of the lack of resources a lot of times. Sometimes it depends upon the agency. When you go to a law enforcement agency or an intelligence agency, honestly, they really look at, this is our information, you don't have a right to it. And what we're trying to do, what President Obama is trying to do, what this whole open government initiative is trying to do is really turn that around, because the information belongs to the people. And it's up to the government agencies to ensure that they get it. Could you stand up so that people can hear you?
Yeah. My question is, you just mentioned Sarah Cohen doing all this great investigative journalism. In the day of sort of age of shrinking newsrooms and newspapers struggling, who's going to really have the resources to make a request, and let alone go to court and litigate? Can you speak a little bit about?
Well, that's precisely, I hope, where the mediation service is going to come in. You know, the government doesn't have the resources to have those long, costly lawsuits either. This is not good. It's not good for requesters. It's not good for the government either. The idea that, particularly for requesters, whether individuals or whether news organizations, for them to be able to actually have a conversation with somebody who is trying to ensure that there is good communication. That doesn't always mean that the requester is going to end up getting what he or she wants. But I think most of us understand that if we really understand the process, if we feel like somebody is talking to us, for heaven's sakes, if somebody will just return a phone call, that would be a big improvement. Yes. Tori.
Yes, hi. My question has to do with the fact that most of the work of government now is being done by private corporations, and as I recall from, or a lot of the work of government is being done by private entities. And so I think in FOIA there's, right, the exemption for release of private company, information. I'm wondering how much of that winds up, or how much of that discussion has become a part of the work you're now doing, where people are sort of running into roadblocks because they're running into the fact that these are private groups, right, doing work for the government that don't necessarily have to give up that kind of information. Has that been part of what you've addressed so far, or is it early?
No, it certainly is. It certainly is an issue, but I do think that the policy that has been in place for a while, that doesn't mean that the word has gotten out to every agency, but the policy that has been in place is that if a contractor is doing the work of the government and creating records that are, in essence, government records, that those records are not shielded from access under the Freedom of Information Act. But again, getting that word out, that is the policy, but getting the word out will be part of what we're trying to do. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about Exemption 1. You mentioned that there was 410 million documents under Exemption 1 that were waiting to be disclassified.
Actually, it's 408. I exaggerated a little bit, but.
Well, I took you at your word. I just did a little bit of quick math. So if one person took 10 minutes to declassify a document, and that person was working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it would take them 2,847,222 days to declassify those documents. And so it seems to me that that's not going to happen. It's fairly ridiculous. So part of the problem is that far too many documents are being classified under Exemption 1. And is there something that the FOIA Ombudsman's Office can do? And I know the Obama administration is looking at the classification process, but is there something that the Ombudsman Office can do to sort of address that issue before they get classified?
Well, I've got some good news for you. One is there's just been created at the National Archives a National Declassification Center whose mission is to bring together in one place all the people that are needed to work on those records to create a much more efficient process. That having been said, it is still going to take a lot of time. It's still going to be costly. But it's a much more efficient and organized way to do it instead of right now, which is all the records go to all the different places that originated that information. Everybody makes different decisions, and then it comes back to one place. It's a very inefficient process. The idea is you get everybody under the same roof, the people who can make the decisions and do it, you just sit down and you do it. So that's going to be good. The other is that as part of that process, there is a big project going on with all the intelligence agencies and the National Archives to study and figure out ways to improve the whole classification process. President Obama has just in December issued a new executive order on national security information that does include automatic declassification for records once they reach the age of 25 years. That's a huge help. If you can just say at a certain age, the records are not classified anymore, that's a great improvement. So there are a lot of people that are worried about precisely that, I can tell you. One more? I don't want to take too much time, Mike, you tell me.
We've got about 5 minutes.
Okay.
I think you referred to finance, money, and bank information before, and I assume that might have to deal with TARP. With ARA funding, have you noticed any higher or lesser degree of secrecy as agencies are getting that money out?
That's an excellent question. The question really is, in terms of financial transparency, all the programs that have come into place in the last year and a half or so to try and deal with the economic crisis, are we seeing more secrecy, more tendency to withhold as opposed to release? Certainly, I think that the requester community would say definitely more secrecy. I'm not sure that's the case, and that is actually one of the issues that our office is trying to tackle. We are looking at pulling together a roundtable of requesters, chiefly the big media requesters, the ones that report on this all the time: Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg News, New York Times, Washington Post. With a number of the government agencies, really to explore precisely that. Is more information really being withheld now, or is that a perception? And what information could be made available proactively without waiting for FOIA requests, which is really something that I think everybody is thinking could make a big difference. Yes, ma'am.
FOIA has traditionally been a legacy media tool. Now we have bloggers, everybody thinks they're journalists. Are you finding that bloggers are requesting this information, and have they swelled the ranks of the requesters?
That is a real question right now in terms of the status of bloggers as members of the news media. I don't have an answer, and I would love to hear from those of you in this room what your thoughts on that. I mentioned as we were talking about the fundamentals of FOIA that members of the news media do fall into a better category in terms of whether or not you have to pay fees for copies of records as well as searches. And the question of whether or not bloggers fit into that category and can claim to be members of the news media and therefore get a better deal in terms of fees is something that's a little unclear right now. Different agencies are doing different things, and it really, for right now, it's still very much on an ad hoc basis. So I don't have an answer for you, but it's out there, and I'd love to hear from any of you that have thoughts on that. Yes.
I'm interested if agencies have been playing nice with you so far, or cooperating with you, and saying, "Oh, by the way, you have to do this now." And if not, what have you done, or what do you anticipate doing when agencies might say, "I don't want to go forward with this," or "I don't want to participate in this mediation," or "I don't want to go. It's just time to live." What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, we have been getting a really good response and a really warm reception. Although I have to say, okay, what about the ones I haven't heard from? Mediation is voluntary. And it's not something that we can really entice people, we can force people to do. We have to really induce them and hope that they will see that it's good for them as well as for the requester. Obviously, we have to persuade. We will also use our collaboration and alliance with the Department of Justice on matters of law, and certainly there is a big body of law out there. And if we can point to the legal precedent as well as the Department of Justice pointing to it and saying, agency, you're just not correct, and if we go to litigation, we're not going to defend you, which is what the Department of Justice can do. Hopefully, that would really make a difference. It would have to make a difference. But for those that are just sort of hanging back and maybe not wanting to do it, we have to, I think, show them by example that it really does make a difference, and it really is to their benefit. Good. Thank you.